Welcome to the CRS Elevation Certificate Training Series on how to fill out an elevation certificate correctly. Specifically, how to do it for the 2023 Elevation Certificate for CRS purposes. This is part 2 of training on general issues that come up with ECs in the CRS program. You do not have to watch part 1 before watching this segment, but please be sure to go back and watch part 1 so you have a full understanding of all the issues related to obtaining complete and accurate FEMA elevation certificates. The CRS EC training videos are primarily created for local officials who have to collect, review, and correct these forms so that they are correct for CRS purposes. Surveyors, engineers, and architects who are authorized by law to certify elevation information should also find these videos helpful. Let's continue on with the training in this video covering General Issues Part 2. Let's start with page issues, specifically the address at the top of each page. With older EC forms, sections A through D were all on page 1. So in many cases, you did not have to include additional pages with your EC. If you did have a building in an unnumbered A zone or an AO zone, you had to supply multiple pages and be sure that the same address that was on the first page was at the top of the others as well. Starting with the 2015 form and continuing through the 2019 and now 2023 form, the format expanded and the main part of the form is now 5 pages long. Since sections C and D are on page 2, you must always submit at least the first 2 pages. If you have a building in an unnumbered A zone with no BFE determined, or an AO zone, then you will have to submit page 3. We'll explain this more in the Section G video, but 2 fields in Section G are now required for CRS communities. That means page 4 is now required every time. There are many combinations of reasons for why only pages 1, 2, and 4, or just pages 1, 3, and 4 are required. However, it's always best to require all 4 pages. That way, you get the full form, and there's no question as to whether a page is missing or not. For CRS purposes, if we see a form that is only a couple of pages, we will do our best to look at the zone, Section D comments, the photos, or any other relevant information to determine if the pages provided are adequate. However, if an additional page was needed, it will be considered an error. Remember, a FEMA form is always the full form. Surveyors should be supplying the full form each time. Note that the new sections H and I are on page 5, but are not required for CRS purposes. However, there is very important insurance information captured in section H, so please watch our video on sections H and I. And again, regardless of how many pages of the EC you submit, always remember to make sure that the same address that's on the first page is on the top of all subsequent pages. That way you are assured, and CRS is assured, that all pages are for the building identified on page 1. Now let's talk about letters of map change, which include a letter of map amendment or LOMA, a letter of map revision, LOMER, or a letter of map revision based on fill, LOMER-F. If any of these have been issued for a property and it impacts the building, not just the property, the letter date and case number should be placed in the comments area of section D. You can see in this case, the LOMA shows that the structure should not be removed from the special flood hazard area. This means there have been no changes in the structure's flood zone designation and it is still in the special flood hazard area. However, in this second example, you see the LOMA is for the structure to be removed from the special flood hazard area. So for this property, the date of the letter and the case number should be written in the comments area of section D. If the surveyor doesn't do this, the floodplain administrator can add this information to the comments area of Section G. Next, let's discuss another fairly common situation with map changes. Often during construction of a building, a new flood insurance rate map, or FIRM, will supersede an older FIRM. When this happens, a different FIRM is effective from the time the building was permitted until the time construction is complete. We cover this situation in the Section B video in more detail, but let's go over it again here. Section B is where all of the map information is located on the EC. Section B must always be filled out using the current FIRM information at the time the EC is signed and dated. Since these types of map changes often cause a little confusion, next we'll talk about how ECs need to be filled out in these situations. Let's go back to our City of Orlando example from that Section B video. We'll say the information in the left column is the FIRM information for Orlando at the time a building is permitted. The information in the right column is the FIRM information at the time the building was completed. The finished construction EC was signed and dated in 2023, right after their new 2023 FIRM took effect. You'll notice the BFE went up with the new FIRM. This might mean the developer built the lowest floor at 89 feet to satisfy the BFE at the time of permitting. Now that a new FIRM is in effect and the BFE is 90, on paper it looks like they have a compliance issue. Here's how to show that on the EC to make sure both a compliance reviewer and an insurance agent gets the correct story. The current FIRM information at the time of the finished construction EC was signed and dated goes in all the required fields in Section B. Be sure to also fill in B10 and B11. Then, the certifier would place the FIRM information in effect at the time of permitting in the Section D comments box. The local officials should be sure the surveyor explains it and provided fields B1, B4, B5, B7, B8, and B9. Now the EC clearly shows that the building met all requirements at the time of permitting for compliance purposes, and it shows the current FIRM information at the time the form was certified. What happens with an EC once your community annexes a property? Let's say you are a community with the community identification number of 777001. In this example, a house is built right outside of your jurisdiction in 2021. In 2022, you annexed that property. In B1B, the EC should show the NFIP number of the community that annexed it or whose jurisdiction it now resides in. Also, if the map number for B4 is now different, that should be changed too. This all hinges on whether you, as the annexing community, have a copy of that EC. You might if you have building and floodplain regulations just outside of your jurisdiction, such as a 1 or 2 mile extraterritorial jurisdiction where you would have had to approve a permit for them and therefore have a copy of the EC. Getting the right community number on the EC ensures it will get the correct CRS discount once you changed it. You just need to make sure you give a copy of this adjusted EC to the current homeowner so they can take it to their insurance agent and get a proper discount. Significant portion of CRS communities deal with construction in V zones. Let's talk about some of the issues we encounter with these situations. When there is a building in the V zone, CRS requires that the community obtain both an EC and a V zone design certificate. Since both must be a part of the permit record for the building, they are considered together as one certificate for CRS purposes. So, if there was an error on either one, it would count as an error for both, which results in an error for that address. Another issue we'll talk about is substantial improvements and V-Zone design certificates. V-Zone design certificates are typically produced before the building is constructed, as a way to certify proper design of these buildings. But once it's built and now substantial improvement is planned, how do you address the V-Zone certificate? A V-Zone certificate is still required. This is so that the engineer can sign off on the improvements made, certify any breakaway walls, and certify that it's being designed properly. However, numbers 5 and 6 near the top of the form do not need to be entered. The new engineer signing this form may not have this information and is only certifying the improvements or repairs. So, for substantial improvements only, we will not count this as an error if the depth of anticipated scour or erosion and the embedment depth of the pilings or foundation is not filled in. And lastly, with V-zones, we'll talk about openings. Let's take a look at land by the ocean or Great Lake. Let's say you wanted to build a house by that body of water. If you are in the VE zone, you must elevate your house. If you place an enclosure underneath that elevated floor, it must be constructed with breakaway walls. No openings are required in V zones since the breakaway walls are designed to collapse once the waves hit them. Now, let's talk about a second scenario where you are building this same house just outside the VE zone. This house is back inland a bit in the AE zone. If the community requires V-zone design and construction standards in a portion of your AE zone, or what the NFIP calls the coastal AE zone, openings must be required. Even though the coastal portion of the building standards require the enclosure underneath that elevated floor to have breakaway walls, because the building is in an A zone, openings must be required. So, for this coastal AE example, even though you may have a V-zone certificate that shows compliant breakaway walls, openings are still required and must be shown on your EC. If they are not, this is a compliance issue, especially when the floor of that enclosure is below the BFE. Conversely, let's say the builder adds the openings and the same engineer that did your V-zone certificate also certifies the EC. If they omit the openings on the form in section A8 because they assume that the breakaway walls meet minimum standards in a coastal AE zone, then this would be an error on your EC. This concludes training on part 2 of the general issues that come up with ECs and the CRS program. Since there can be many errors on the EC, we will also cover how to correct them once you identify them in a separate video called How to Correct an Elevation Certificate. Be sure to watch that video as well as others on filling out each section correctly at crsresources.org/training. Thank you for watching and learning.